Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Paikin, and we welcome you to this historic hall, St. Lawrence Hall, in downtown Toronto for another edition of TVO Today Live. Our subject tonight, should Canada pivot to China? We've got a full house here, and it's all possible thanks to the generosity of the Wilson Foundation. Red Wilson, thank you for your efforts and continuing to support what we're doing here on TVO. With us now to explore the future of Canada's relationship with China, let's welcome Constantine Karayannopoulos, longtime board member with the Canada-China Business Council, who's a critical minerals expert and businessman, founder and now retired CEO of the rare earth company NEO. Vina Nadjibulla, Vice President, Research and Strategy at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Mary Ng, former Member of Parliament for Markham Thornhill, who is Canada's longest-serving Minister of International Trade, having served from 2019 to earlier this year. And Lynette Ong, Distinguished Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Toronto and Director of the China Governance Lab at the Munk School at U of T. Let's welcome them to St. Lawrence Hall tonight, shall we? Our plan for tonight, invited guests, is pretty simple. We are going to ask, where are we at with China? What are the risks and opportunities of dealing more with China? How should Canada approach engaging with China? And ultimately, the big question, should we, as they say in foreign affairs, pivot to China? So that's on our itinerary tonight. Before we do all of that, though, I want to survey this audience and get a sense of where everybody's at. I'm going to ask you two separate questions. So let's see a show of hands on these questions. In light of our deteriorating relationship with the United States, Canada should actively re-engage with the People's Republic of China. Hands up. And hands down. We don't share the same values. They're an authoritarian dictatorship. We should not attempt to pivot to China. Hands up. Interesting. Hands down. Okay, a lot more yeses for the first question than there were for the second. Good to know what this audience thinks, because at the end of the evening, I may just survey you again and see if anybody's minds have been changed by what transpired. Meantime, let's get a few facts on the table here to figure out where we stand. In 2024, Canada exported $30 billion of products to China, but we imported $87 billion worth. That said, there are big tariffs going both ways. We have imposed 100% tariffs on EVs and 25% on steel. China has put 100% tariffs on our canola and 25% on pork and seafood. So, with all of that in place, let's get the former minister to work first of all. As a trading partner, how important is China to Canada right now?
Well, China has been Canada's second largest trading partner, and I think in the most recent numbers, they're now third after Europe. So we have United States, we have what was China, and then Europe, and now it's inverse. So it's a significant economy in the world, and China buys from Canada. We sell to China. And as you know, as a trade minister, and as you know, looking at it for Canadian businesses as a market to access, I think it's important to consider that there are jobs that are tied to that very trading relationship.
This was a big part of your responsibilities when you were the minister.
Right, but having said that, Canadians have often said to me and to the government that we trade with values that are really important to Canada as well. Values like the rule of law. Values like our position on on fair wages, or on the environment, or on issues of a range of issues that are really important to Canadians around human rights. Those values have to intersect with an economic relationship.
And we shall come back and consider those, of course, during the course of our evening. Constantine, how would you answer the question about, as a trading partner, the importance of China to us right now?
There's no question that China is an important trading partner. In view of your earlier question to the audience, especially now when it seems that our primary trading relationship with our friends south of the border is deteriorating. Canada is a trading state. Multilateralism has always helped Canada, And I think in view of what's been going on with regards to the United States, I think we have no choice but to look for expanding our trade with practically everybody else, including China, including Europe, including India, the Asia Pacific. And ultimately, we need to go to where the markets are, where the opportunities are. So yes, yes, China is an important partner, and I think invariably it will have to become a much bigger partner because the deterioration of our trading relationship with the United States presents an existential issue for the country. And we need to balance that risk by trading with folks that we traded with in the past, and perhaps we can do more.
What say you, Vina?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be on this panel. Thank you so much for the invitation, and really look forward to the questions from the audience. I think when we say China is our second largest trading partner, we have to recognize that the gap between number one and number two is about 70 points. So it almost means very little, from 76% to less than 4% in terms of our exports. We trade with the European Union more, and we trade with the CPTPP countries, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement countries more. So yes, China is an important trading partner, but we have to right-size the understanding of that, and we also have to recognize that when we do trade with China, there are also risks involved. And especially when we're over-dependent on China for certain trade, like in the sector like canola, we're opening ourselves to potential retaliation when there are disagreements with China on diplomatic or political issues. And while it is obviously tempting to say, given that the US has become so disruptive, we need to pivot and look back at China, I think we have to be cautious. Yes, there are sectors in which we can do with China, more with China, and China, of course, is the second largest economy in the world, so we will have to. But we have to be cautious, we have to be clear-eyed, and we have to de-risk at the same time as we deepen trade in some ways with China. So do less in sectors where we're over-dependent and vulnerable, do less in critical sectors, which can open up national security concerns, and look at other parts of Asia. Asia is not just China. There are many other countries we have to diversify, and we have to reduce over-reliance on both the US and China. However disruptive the US, let's not forget that China started the disruption that has led to the kind of crisis that we're in.
Lynette, your view on this?
I think China is becoming more important, but I think in answer to your earlier question about should we pivot towards China, I think the answer is not binary. I don't see that as an either or. I think, in the age of uncertainty, especially with what is going on with the US administration right now, we should think about diversifying risk. I would suggest that, for a long time, if we take a longer view of things, right, I think Canada has been living in the margins of great power. We have been a beneficiary of economic prosperity and political stability in the United States. So we have been complacent in that sense, right? And 6 months ago, we were jolted out of our complacency. And now we are thinking about the question of whether or not we should pivot towards China. I think the question to us is that in the age of uncertainty, how do we actually diversify economic partnership and political partnership? I think with political partnership, we shouldn't be looking towards China. We should be looking towards with Europe and other democratic countries, as the Prime Minister has signed a deal with Europe with respect to military spending recently. But economic partnership, I think China is an option and is a very important option. And as other panelists have alluded to earlier, China, we shouldn't stop at China, but we should start with China because it is the second largest market. But aside from China, we should also be thinking about Indo-Pacific countries such as Japan, such as Southeast Asia, such as India, so on and so forth. So I would say China is a good place to start, but it shouldn't be the place to end.
Mary, it's been fascinating to watch the Canadian-Chinese relationship over the last, let's say, 60 years. Some of us can remember when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau opened to China before the United States did. And our relationship had its ups and downs over the years. It got pretty good under Jean Chrétien with the Team Canada trips. It got pretty bad under Justin Trudeau for a while. And then we heard Mark Carney say a couple of different things during the leaders' debate when he was running for, he was the Prime Minister running to keep his job. He said China was the biggest problem he envisaged for Canada's future. Now he talks about strategic partnership, a turning point, and he's going to visit Xi. What do we make of all of that?
So I would agree with, with what Vina was saying a little earlier about needing to enter into this relationship in a way that really does balance the interests for Canada as a rules-based democracy and to the economic interests and opportunities that are there. To your question about, about the pivot, I also agree. It's not an either or. I think that given the geopolitical headwinds that exist today, I think what you're seeing in Prime Minister Carney do is take a pragmatic approach around the economic opportunity, while at the same time, I don't think that the position he took in that debate has also changed. We do have to consider the issues today. When you think about trade, it isn't just it's a new market or an expanded market. We're looking to do more services. We're looking to do more goods. It is not like that. I mean, today, when you're talking about trade, you're also talking about trade in data and AI. And critical infrastructure.
Not just manufactured goods.
And critical minerals. So you are talking about trade that is broad. But at the same time, you're also talking about tourism. You're talking about education. You're talking about agri-foods and all the great things that Canada has to offer. So those are the puts and takes that we have to consider in Canada as you think about this relationship. I think that there are additives to the relationship, and I think that there is a eyes wide open approach to how you step through it. But to the point of diversification, I think that Canada, as a middle power country with partners in the CPTPP, as Vina said, CPTPP includes countries like Japan, like Singapore, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Vietnam, like Malaysia, that are in a rules-based structure. The United Kingdom acceded to it when I was the minister. Costa Rica is going through that right now. They are, countries like Indonesia, which that was the last agreement I negotiated with Indonesia. These are economies where under a rules-based system, under a CPTPP partnership, there are rules for how we trade. So there's a dispute resolution system when there is a dispute to be had among the trading partners. And there are rules to which you govern how you do your trade. How do you deal with data governance in digital trade, for example, among the partners? Those are the very issues that Canadians need to think about. And that certainly government, when they're making policy, trade policy,
let me pick up on that.
About,
I'll pick up on that with you, Vina. Are you clear in your mind where the current Prime Minister of Canada stands, in as much as he said one thing during the leaders' debate, but he's saying different things now?
I think both things can be true at the same time. Okay. So China does represent a threat to our national security and to our economic security interests as well, and we can unpack that. At the same time, obviously, we do need to re-engage with China at the highest level diplomatically to be able to manage that relationship. So what Prime Minister Carney is saying is that we need to talk to all countries, including those with whom we have serious disagreements, but the disagreements have not gone away. Just because President Trump is being really mean hasn't made China any better, right? So we have to be able to hold multiple things in our heads. And so with respect to China, what he's proposing is that we can do more on certain things where interests align, right? So he has this framework of variable geometry of engagement, right? That will apply also to kind of coalitions of interests that we will build, but also with certain countries we'll have more relationships because values and interests align. With certain countries like China, we may have certain interests that align, but we have to be clear-eyed that our values do not, our political systems do not, and all the disagreements that we had before the Liberation Day tariffs are still there with China. Now, the challenge becomes, because even with selective engagement, even saying we want to do more with China on climate change, we want to sell them more of our energy exports from TMX or from LNG Canada, we have to recognize that we may wish to compartmentalize, but China doesn't do that. The Chinese Communist Party does not generally compartmentalize. If they have an issue with you, like they do now with Japan over what the Prime Minister said in response to a question from an opposition member of parliament, they then target you by limiting travel of tourists. They travel you they put a ban on sale of certain exports. So in other words, China does connect issues and does weaponize dependence in trade. So even on issues like energy, we have to be clear-eyed that we shouldn't become over-dependent. I guess that's the final final sort of lesson that we've learned from the current experience is over-dependence on any trading partner, even one that used to be reliable like the US, is a bad idea in the current environment.
Let me get a sense from you, because I think you were part of those days when Prime Minister Chrétien would take a bunch of business people and premiers and so on. You were part of the Team Canada trips, right?
That's
25 and 30 years ago?
Yes.
So how does business, how do you run a business given that one day we can be friends and our Prime Minister goes and visits and brings huge delegations, and the next day things are pretty much cut off?
Well, the Team Canada missions were one of the best things that could happen to a small company like ours, because it really opened doors and it brought us legitimacy in front of both of our counterparties as well as the government. And
What kind of business were you trying to do over there?
We started by buying controlling interest in 2 rare earth production plants in China. So we expanded that business, and 2 years ago when I retired, we had 10 plants around the world, including one in Peterborough, Ontario. Our headquarters was in Ontario, here in Canada, in Toronto. We had plants in Thailand, Korea, Estonia, and Germany. So we established a global company, but we started in China with those 2 plants. And our participation in those Team Canada missions made a massive difference to how we developed.
So those were the good old days. What would you call what's going on today?
We're recovering from the bad days, although we've seen ups and downs. I mean, the relationship with China has not been smooth all the way. During the Chrétien years, it was a period of growth. Then during the initial part of the Harper years, things slowed down, and I remember things picked up again when Minister Baird started going to China and started mending that relationship. And then, of course, during the Trudeau years, there was obviously the 2 Michaels, but we behaved as a country in ways that among friends, I call it we scored in our own net. And I think now with Prime Minister Carney, I think there's a bit more of a mature approach to international relations. And listen, I mean, in my view, even though I'm not a huge fan of him, I go by what Henry Kissinger said, that states have interests that don't have friends. So we need to decide what's in the national interest. And if we come across issues that are not in the interest of Canada, then we have to be wide-eyed, cognizant of what's going on, and absolutely vigilant. And I haven't heard anybody advocate that we should go all in on the Chinese relationship, expanding with no barriers, with no critical thinking. I think what is being advocated correctly, that we need to go in with our eyes wide open, I think that applies to every relationship with every state in the world. And by the way, I don't want to monopolize the time. The other thing that Henry Kissinger said that, again, it's engraved in the back of my head especially since the latest Trump incarnation, is that to be a friend of the United States, to be an enemy of the United States is very risky. To be a friend is lethal. And that's what we're finding ourselves, unfortunately. So I'll say one more thing before I stop. As a public company CEO, our company had to disclose any dependency with any customer where your revenues were more than 10% of your total revenues. So in the business world, public company-wise, a 10% dependency on any single customer is a risk that you have to discuss how you're going to address it or what you're doing about it to protect the interests of your shareholders. I don't know what the number is when it comes to countries. I'm sure it's not 75%.
I think he's just made the case for diversification and doing more diversification so that we are not going to be dependent to anyone, and that Canada is in a position of being able to create both sovereignty, strength, and determination for our future because of that.
And we need to absolutely do our hardest to reinstitute multilateralism, because in the process, some of the global institutions that served our interests very well over the last few decades, created by our American friends, have been destroyed. I mean, when was the last time anything happened at the WTO?
World Trade Organization.
Yeah, World Trade
I don't
Organization.
think WTO is the answer, and I think even our prime
It's not the
minister is
answer, it's one of the
recognizing that
many things that need to come
we
together.
have to
though.
work through plurilateral groups,
Absolutely.
not multilateral. Because this, I mean, we have to be realistic, right?
Mark
The
Carney
WTO
says that.
Yeah, he
He
says
uses
that.
the word plurilateral.
In fact, in his Economist op-ed, which hasn't gotten a lot of visibility here in Canada.
Should
but
we
I
give it a
think,
little love here? I think
sure,
I got it
you
here.
have a quote from him?
I
Go
got
for
the
it.
quote.
It's called the
Go for it.
variable of geometry, right?
Yeah, it's the variable,
So
it's a
he's-
coalitions, interest-based coalitions, and he says, in the twilight of multilateralism, we have to turn to plurilateralism or something like that.
Well, okay, here's what he had to say. This was back in November in The Economist. You know, what's the Prime Minister's approach to these issues? He says nostalgia
Is not a strategy.
is not a strategy, exactly. We should not pine to go back to the world that was. We should focus on building something better. The twilight of multilateralism will be followed by the rise of plurilateralism.
I had it almost correct.
You got it right. No, it's states that embrace variable geometry, you use that expression, weaving new networks and constructing pragmatic alliances will be best placed to thrive in this new age.
So I think, Steve, that is actually the very definition of a middle power. Right? We are a middle power
exactly
because we are a prize taker. We cannot set rules. So when we deal with superpower, either with the United States, which is very hostile or unpredictable, like in China, Canada as a middle power, we typically have to lean on multilateral institutions because rules are stable. But now that multilateral institutions such as United Nations, WTO, or UN are not that reliable,
What do?
we need to rely on these, what Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, called ad hoc coalition of the willing. But I think what has happened, you know, to give you some examples of the coalition of the willing, such as against arbitrary detention, against China's monopoly of critical minerals, these are very ex-post measures. When things happen, then we think about putting the coalition together. But I think we should be preemptively thinking is bring together coalition, such as those that have actually suffered trade coercion from China, such as South Korea, Japan, Australia, so on and so forth, and exchange notes about how do we deal with these problems when we face these issues. So I think, you know, everyone has touched on the issue of diversification of market. I would argue that as a business person, it's actually easier said than done because economies like the idea of economies of scale. We want to scale it up because we can lower the cost.
Yeah.
But it's actually very difficult to diversify. So if we could do some preemptive approach, such as gathering together some coalitions to better deal with China when problems come, I think we'll be
Let me get Vina, then Mary.
better prepared.
You can see we have a lot of views on this panel. So, one thing that I found interesting in that op-ed, Steve, is that while the Prime Minister talks about these interest-based coalitions, the examples that he gives are all Europe-focused. So he talks about the coalition of the willing vis-a-vis Ukraine. He talks about Safe Europe in terms of procurement that Canada has now joined. He even talks about docking the CPTPP trading bloc that Mary spoke about with the EU, so that together they can create scale that actually matches US and China. So at a time when both US and China have become protectionists, don't follow rules, smaller countries have to come together, and the two biggest blocks would be EU and CPTPP. So, and then one place where he mentions China in that entire op-ed is to do with climate, and he says that we can have a coalition around climate that sort of uses Chinese and Indian technology and European rules and Brazilian sort of approach or something, right? But that's kind of like a wish list. It doesn't exist and nobody's really talking about it. So the interesting thing is that even in that conversation, it's less about China, it's more about diversifying and building deeper relationship with other non-major powers, basically with neither the US nor China, to be able to create rules-based trading where we actually, as a middle-sized country, have a voice and we can exercise our interests in a way that's more protective. So, and then a final thing that I'll mention is, yes, it's true that 75% of our trade is with the US and we have to diversify that. But with China, we have over-dependencies already. So, and it would be easy for us to just say, you know, we need to deal with the agricultural tariffs. We have to continue to sell canola to them. Well, we've had disruptions to canola trade multiple times already. We have to learn the lesson. It's like, fool me once, right? So we cannot continue to sell 63% of our canola seed to that market. So we have to diversify, move up the value chain. Same thing in terms of some of our seafood products, 97% going to China market. I get it, it's an easier market, but we have to do the hard work now. And we have to be cognizant that China will retaliate if we disagree with them on other issues. Taiwan, Ukraine, all linked.
It's all linked. Mary.
So the work of diversification, I absolutely agree. For businesses, they would much rather go into one single market. It's way easier to do. But I would say I have never had a mandate in my entire time as trade minister that did not have diversification in it. So in 2018, the mandate the Prime Minister gave to me was increase your non-US exports by 50% by 2025. That was sort of in the order of about $291 billion. We've done it. We've negotiated agreements. If you think about the CPTPP, that covers a gigantic swath of Asian markets that does not include the United States, nor does it include China. We are at the negotiating table with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. By the way, all of them added up is 700 million people. CPTPP, 500 million people. So you're talking in there, sort of you're heading towards about a billion people, and that's without China and without the United States. So, and to the plurilaterals, that is essentially the work that we have been building on, right? I mean, creating trading blocks on a foundation of rules that allow market access, but that allow for things like how do you treat your workers within your economy so that there is actually fair trade? Because in Canada, when you have a dumping of, let's say, a product, right? I mean, it depresses the prices and it makes our companies less competitive. Those issues are actually dealt with at the trade negotiating table, whereas trading partners, you negotiate those rules and you decide this is how we're gonna engage with one another. And then you've got dispute resolution mechanisms that you are then bound by as well. So I would say that Canada is in a great place. Why? Because at present, with our existing trade agreements, we already have access to 65% of the world's economy. In Europe, through the CETA bloc, CPTPP, Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world, that's now done. India is going to, is going to get worked on, and ASEAN as a bloc is going to, and those negotiations, by the way, in the ASEAN started in 2016.
ASEAN meaning the Southeast Asian nations.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And many of the countries that are in ASEAN we already have agreements with through CPTPP, like Vietnam, like Malaysia, like Singapore.
Okay. Let me go to Lynette on this, though.
The plurilateral, my point is, absolutely, and we're doing that through trade architecture. We need to keep doing that. Okay.
I'm going to remind everybody the numbers I said earlier. In 2024, Canada exported $30 billion to China, imported $87 billion. So, Lynette, my question is, do they actually want to buy stuff from us or just sell stuff to us?
I think both.
It doesn't sound like it.
Well, China is a much larger country compared to Canada, right? And I would actually suggest that the straw poll that you took at the beginning of the audience, the results are actually not reflective of the Canadian public.
That's right.
Right? And I think the audience, if I could use that word, is a self-selected one. Those people who come to this event, they are actually more pro-China than your average Canadians. So I think the issue of framing, so you said that Mark Carney said different things when he was a political candidate and he's now a prime minister decision maker is very different, but his status has actually changed. But I think what is also important in, I think, selling China, that we should engage China with a lot of nuances, is how we actually frame that debate. And this would be my suggestions. And I think, public opinion with respect to China has changed drastically in the last 6 months. There are now more people unfavorable towards Washington, D.C. than towards Beijing. That's in China's favor. And the other thing is that I think we should think about China as a very nuanced position. I think with the shifting of the sand, we should not, I would say, not keep talking about values. So a UBC law professor said that we should frame the debate in terms of maximizing Canadians' interests, including treaty obligations to human rights treaty, which I would absolutely agree. Because then countries like China cannot say that we stand on moral high grounds and criticize them because we are just maximizing our interests. I think if I'm the prime minister, which I am not, I'm also not in a position of advising him. But if I have the privilege, I would say to him that think about how you actually sell the question of engagement with China. The framing is critical.
Constantine, you want to come in on that, on the issue of whether they actually want to buy stuff from us or only sell stuff to us?
Well, my experience is that China, within China, among the Chinese consumers, Canada is a great brand. They want to buy food stuff, they want to buy. There's a reason why we export so much fish, because the Chinese consumer wants Canadian fish. They want Canadian products. Arc'teryx is a huge brand. It's no longer Canadian, but it's a huge brand. There is an affinity for things Canadian in China that we need to continue to work on, and that's why Canadian food exports in China are what they are. China is a massive manufacturing workshop, okay? However, the advances being made in China are really scary. I think one of the reasons we need to trade more is to continue to engage so we can see what's coming down the pipe. Because
what do you mean scary?
I was in Beijing about a month ago. After one of my meetings, I walked into an EV dealership by Xiaomi. I was blown away what you can buy in China for $50,000. And this is, I guess, what the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs are designed to protect us from, assuming that there was any thinking going into those tariffs, as opposed to some reflexive reaction to what the Americans did when they imposed the 100% tariffs. And that actually is a bit of a sore point for me, because the Europeans had imposed tariffs after 2 years of study between 17% and 42% on Chinese EVs into Europe. And they went through all the producers of EVs, and they had a different tariff rate for each producer. The moment the US imposed 100% tariffs, we jumped right in without any thinking, I assume there was any thinking because it was almost reflexive. However, we could have taken an approach that was much more analytical. And by the way, the Chinese government respects data, and the Europeans hit them with data, not that it helped much, but still, we have a number of choices. So when we impose tariffs of 100% on Chinese EVs, which by the way, we don't make any in Canada yet, what did we expect to happen? I mean, what would have happened if we imposed tariffs on American or German producers? Would they have not retaliated with tariffs on our products? I mean, that's the way it works. So do the Chinese want to buy stuff? Yes, of course, but you see, they want to buy stuff that helps their own industry. So we need to figure out what are the materials and the products that we can sell to them that fit both the Canadian interest and the Chinese interest.
Okay, we're about halfway through here, so this is the point where I do what's called a re-racking. We remind everybody what we're doing here. We are here in downtown Toronto in the historic St. Lawrence Hall. You know what? Sir John A. Macdonald spoke in this hall. George Brown spoke in this hall. Thomas D'Arcy McGee spoke in this hall. No, I did not cover any of those speeches, despite what you might think. But I do remember the last time I was in this hall was 41 years ago, when there was a new leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada named Brian Mulroney, who came here to give a speech, and I covered that speech in this hall. And it's magnificent. The history here is just everywhere. Anyway, we are talking something very different tonight. We're talking China, Canada's relationship with China going forward. And I want to remind everybody who our guests are. Constantine Karayannopoulos, board member at the Canada-China Business Council. Vina Nadjibulla, Vice President, Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Mary Ng, former Minister of International Trade for Canada, and Professor Lynette Ong, University of Toronto, and the Munk School. Vina, I'm going to pick up the conversation here, which is to say, there was a school of thought for a very long time that if we open to China, if we trade with China, if we try to make things more normal with China, they will liberalize. Goodness knows they might even become more democratic.
Yes.
Is there anybody who believes any of that anymore?
I haven't met them recently, so there might be still some people who believe that, but I think most...
So was it worth doing then?
Most would agree that that was probably naive even at the time. And if anything, I mean, if you look now, we're becoming more like China in that we're all resorting back to industrial strategy and industrial policy. We're all becoming more protectionist and more mercantilist in some ways. So whether or not the experiment worked in the other way is, I think, a more interesting question right now. So no, I don't think the economic integration and engagement with China led to any democratic development, certainly not in the last 10 years. I mean, we can unpack what happened and did not happen. That's a bigger question, but
it did bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of that is due to the hard work of the Chinese people, rather than necessarily the policies of the Chinese Communist Party or even the engagement with the world. So, I mean, I think all of that is true, but we have to go back to the question that you asked: does China want to buy anything from Canada? I think that is an important question, in that the Chinese growth model very much is export driven. So more than $1 trillion of surplus in trade, and it's growing. In fact, even though the US market is now closing to China, they're selling more to Europe, they're selling more to Southeast Asia, they're selling more to Africa, Latin America, and they would like to sell us more of their stuff too, including EVs. Constantine is absolutely right. But we have to start thinking about what kind of economy do we want to have in Canada 10, 20, 30 years from now? How do we maintain our status of living? How do we stay a prosperous, developed country? We have to continue to industrialize. We have to continue to invest in technologies of tomorrow, not just sell the raw materials with which we've been blessed. So yes, China wants to buy our stuff in the same way that they want to buy oil from Russia as well, in the same way that they want to buy raw materials from us. But do we want to just continue to sell those products, or do we actually want to become a proper industrialized country? And if that is the question, then deeper engagement with China leads to problems that we're now seeing elsewhere in Europe as well as in Southeast Asia, right? They're also worried about, can they have a chance of developing their own manufacturing and domestic economy if China continues to subsidize, continues to manipulate the market, manipulate its currency, and do everything that it has done very effectively to get to where it is.
Lynette, please.
Well, I think trade is a reflection of comparative advantage. There are reasons why we are not selling manufactured goods to China, because they are much lower, cheaper labor costs, right? I think that's the rule of economics. I'm not sure whether I buy Trump's argument of, every country should become industrialized, should have more factories than China. I think there are reasons why countries trade with each other. Our comparative advantage lies with the agricultural sector and services, and those are the things that we sell to China, and they sell manufactured goods to us. I'm not sure, industrialization is the way to go for every country, because of where economics and comparative advantage and labor cost works.
Vina wants back on that.
That's in theory the case, Lynette. I completely agree with you that in an ideal world, once you sort of move to a certain level, the wages have to go up and standard of living have to go up and your currency has to appreciate as well. But when a state actually controls all those elements. I mean, you know as much as I know that in China right now, the consumers are less empowered, they can't spend more, wages are suppressed.
Sure.
Right? So there is manipulation happening at a big scale by the state.
I think that argument would apply to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, that has similar cost structure to
That's right, and they are suffering
China.
right now.
That China is subsidizing its labor versus other countries. But for countries like Canada, do we actually want to build more factories to get more of our young people employed in factories rather than services sector jobs?
Well, it depends what kind of factories.
I think we'd love to make more cars, high-paying jobs,
I think we also want to...
We want high-paid and high-value jobs.
Yeah.
So industries are not necessarily the way to go.
Yeah. Mary, let me ask you this. I wonder if, to a certain extent, if we consider this issue of whether to pivot to China, do they have us over a barrel in some respects, in as much as, everybody's watching how much trouble we're having right now trying to renegotiate whatever we're calling it, CUSMA or USMACA or whatever it is,
You smack us.
They're smacking us, all right. So in some respects, they're seeing what's happening between us and the United States right now, and presumably the Chinese are thinking, well, they're having trouble over there, so we should take advantage of that. Isn't that the case?
I wouldn't look at it quite that way. They may very well, but I think for Canadians have to ask ourselves the question, where do we want to be? What do we need to do to have the economy we want in the future.
This is something
What-
you and Vina agree on.
Yes, I mean, what can we do within the country to remove interprovincial trade barriers so that we are more competitive ourselves as a country?
Turns out the answer is not that much.
Well,
at
we
least
should
we
do
haven't
more.
done too much so far.
We need to do more. And how do we look at the kind of value chains that we want and supply chains that we want, and with whom do we want that with today? So given the issues that we are facing with the United States, you have to then make a choice. Who else in the world do you want to be doing this with, right? I mean, so if you think about critical minerals, we have an abundance. We want to also do value add processing in addition to the sustainable extraction. We want to be able to partner with whom in those investments for the extraction and then the deployment of those, of what comes out of the critical minerals to aerospace, to clean technology, to the range of sectors and industries that are out there. And who do you want to do that with? China is a choice, but should it be the only choice?
No,
and
nobody.
The answer,
I don't think anybody's
right,
saying it is.
No, I would say that today today is a perfect time where we ought to be looking at the trading partners that we want to pursue and who want to pursue us. You were talking about those trade missions that are very effective. In my time as trade minister, I have taken trade missions into every single CPTPP and ASEAN country, every single one. And as a minister, it's one thing for me to say, I would like to take a trade mission. It only happens when businesses themselves think that there's a market, that there are investors, that they can go there, and that they want to use the value of their federal government to open that door and get them there. And guess what? They want to go to CPTPP. They want to go into ASEAN. They want to go to Europe, elsewhere, but as a choice, that I think is the choice that we need to.
Yeah, there's been talk about, we talk about critical minerals, but we haven't done much. We have abandoned industrial strategy to the hands of the Chinese.
Yes, we're importing their strategy.
China did what China had to do for its own interests. We're coming back to Henry Kissinger and states having interests. What are we doing about our own citizens' interests? Let me give you an example, Stephen. According to the Globe and Mail a year ago, the Canadian government has committed to subsidies worth about $55 billion over the next 15 years to the automotive industry for EVs.
Yep.
Some of it is real cash, some of it is tax points, etc. How much of that, Madam Minister, went into critical mineral development?
What's the answer? Zero?
Zero. And let me ask you the other question, which I asked.
That's actually not true.
But the critical mineral strategy has
The
money there too.
Critical
So I think
minerals, yes.
Constantine
So
is
it's not
being
called.
selective
So it's
here.
not called industrial, like sort of
There is
developing
some money
auto,
behind
but there is a whole critical minerals sort of strategy and a pot of money that actually went specifically to that. So
Well, not in relation to the $55 billion that was spent on automotive
pots.
industry, right?
Different pots.
And what industry is the largest consumer of critical minerals today and the fastest growing industry? EVs. Fact of life. Batteries, lithium in batteries, and rare earths for rare earth magnets driving the electric motors. How many plants do we have in Canada that can take raw materials from the ground and transform them into the materials that need to go into the batteries and the motors?
Zero.
Zero.
But there
If
have been lots of announcements about building some, right?
That's right.
over the years.
But there's
Through
no
the major
action so
projects
far.
as well. Through the major
Well,
projects.
I
that
can
just
tell
got
you that
announced.
there's only 2 plants in the world that produce rare earths in commercial large-scale quantities outside of China, one in Malaysia, owned by an Australian company, and one in Europe, in Estonia, owned by my former
Okay,
company.
but Carney and Ford are making announcements all the time about
Yes.
new factories being built here.
So I think
We
there-
have to wait. However, here's the fallacy with just talking about critical minerals and continuing to approach the world like we continue to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. We can dig holes in the ground until the cows come home. But today, the only markets for the output of these holes in the ground, lithium and rare earths, perhaps copper is a bit more global, the situation, but if we dug rare earths and lithium out of the ground, the only place we could ship it would be China, because that's where the conversion and the value-added
Unless we
facilities
build
are.
refining capacity.
Unless we could have taken one of those 55 billion and said, we will build, or we will facilitate the creation.
Taking,
Please.
I understand you, and you represent the business council, the business corporation.
I've gone a little bit beyond.
But I think if we think
I
about...
pay a lot of taxes in Canada, and I employ a lot of people.
I understand that.
Okay, all
I understand that. I think if we think about the interest of the countries as a whole, is divided into producers and consumers. Producers have the power, political power, to organize lobby group and get business council to represent them. Consumers do not. And consumers do not. So if we think about Chinese EVs, right now we don't have any EV plant. So if we allow cheap EVs to come in, it might hurt our EV producers in the future, but our consumers would benefit tremendously. And that's a welfare gain that we don't read about in the Globe and Mail, in the Star, or TVO, because consumers are the silent majority that don't have political voices.
I hear you.
Let's not forget
but
about
let me do
it.
this.
That's not the point
I
I
don't
was
want the
making,
clock to
Stephen.
get. I don't want the clock.
I was
Hang on a
making
second.
a point.
Time out, because the clock is
underway.
going to get away from us, and we're not going to get a chance to talk about the other thing that we have to mention here, which are the risks. We've talked about a lot of the opportunities. We've talked about, okay, we got to get into the risks here. And I'm going to give you a bit of a list here, and then I'm going to go to you and see what concerns you. There are a long list of reasons to be concerned about increased engagement with China. Intimidation of expats and diaspora communities, espionage, well-documented election interference in this country, China's support of Russia's war machine against Ukraine, long-standing threat to Taiwan, human rights violations, persecution of religious minorities, some labor practices which do not stand up to light very well. Vina, that list, or maybe something else. What's the biggest risk to Canada if we re-engage with China?
Well, the good news, Steve, is that we have been speaking about being cautious and considering those risks, including economic risk, which I think we were trying to get at in terms of the kind of industries we want to have. So we're deep into that part of the conversation, is the kind of risks and how do we manage those risks? Because again, the answer is not this binary choice of do we engage with China or do we not. I think everybody on this panel says, yes, we have to up our game in terms of engagement with China.
Yes, but.
Yes, but, exactly. Or yes, and.
Or yes, and,
yes,
right.
So yes, we do need to engage more and have more dialogue, more understanding of China at all levels, business, academia, government. And we have to be cognizant that there are many, many risks which need to be managed. So I did a piece for Policy Magazine recently where I sort of laid out kind of 6 elements that have to be in place for us to do more with China, right? So, and it begins with guardrails around the areas which we want to protect. So be that sensitive technologies, be that research, so whatever that list is.
Democracy?
Right? Sure, foreign interference, yes, there's a long list, right? So there's the guardrails piece. Then there is the area where we have to be clear on the stuff that we want to do more of. What are the specific sectors? We have to get granular, right? Like it's no longer just about let's sell more or let's buy more. We have to get more specific, right? Then we have to have the actual tools to be able to protect ourselves. So all of the things that we haven't yet mentioned, we've mentioned some of the kind of the positive things around subsidies or critical mineral strategy or whatever, but we also need to have screening mechanisms, investment screening mechanisms.
Do we have that yet?
So we have Investment Act, but it needs to actually be better applied. Right now, it's very discretionary to the minister. It's unclear, so it makes the system less predictable. So there are a number of other things. And then we have to build coalitions because alone, we will never have leverage vis-a-vis China. So it's very hard because US used to lead all of this and we used to kind of follow as a Western bloc. We have to now be used to a world in which US does not lead, right? So, and we have to show leadership and with other European, Asian democracies to be able to together figure out how to manage risks. So again, yes, there are many, many risks, but the answer remains the same. We have to continue to talk to China, engage with China, and we have to build leverage domestically, and we have to build competence domestically. So Lynette mentioned about the attitude in the general public. It is still fairly negative towards China, but there's also very low level of understanding of China, of Indonesia, of Malaysia, of all these other countries, right? So, I mean, I live in Vancouver where we do feel like a Pacific nation, but when you come east, as much as we talk about being a Pacific nation, it's a very Eurocentric, Euro-Atlantic kind of place. And In order to be able to engage, you have to know the other side, right? And we have to invest in that.
Constantine, does it give you any pause that if we do dive in deeper with China, we are potentially inviting the Chinese Communist Party to have a bigger role in Canada?
Yes.
Pause, yeah, and listen, I mean, there are countries that we trade with that we have to be absolutely careful about what we do and how we do it. And that's pretty well everybody. However, there's no question we have to continue to be vigilant. Okay? We need to protect the national interest. Now, we also need to learn from successful examples from others. I look at the Australians. Who was the beneficiary of Canadian canola oil not going to China? Australia and Brazil. Do we have a problem with the way the Australians run their country or their businesses with the Chinese? I mean, they had trade frictions. They're part of the Five Eyes. They're buying nuclear subs, and guess where those subs are going to be patrolling? It's not going to be the Arctic or the Pacific. It's probably the South China Sea. And yet, their trade relation with China continues to increase. Wine is going back into China. Iron ore has never stopped going into China from Australia. So I think we need to look at what others are doing and how successful they are. And every once in a while, the Australians, when Chinese investment is trying to control sensitive parts of their industry, they say no. So they're cognizant and they're very vigilant. And I think we can probably thread the needle perhaps a bit more carefully than we have done so in the past.
Let me give a heads up to this audience. You see the microphone placed in the middle of the room. So I'm going to ask one more question here, and then we're going to start to take questions from you folks. So let me throw this phrase that Mark Carney used in his November piece in The Economist, variable geometry, as a plausible approach to engaging China. Mary, what do you interpret that to mean, and should we do it?
I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, the variable geometry that leads to plurilateralism. Plurilateralism is just simply creating different partnerships with others who you could create some common ground with, a set of interests. So getting away from values, but from interests that you have shared interests with, and to do that together in a way that actually will help you have the kind of leverage and the influence that you will need beyond yourself. So that
and
list
are we well poised to do it?
I think we absolutely are. I think we are as a middle country. I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done to do that, but are we poised as Canada? Yes. We know how to do this. We have partners around the world that we could do it with, and we need to get on and do it. That list that you talked about, it's not just Canada that has that list. It's many other countries. So you're going to have other middle powers. You're going to have other people in that variable geometry set that you can work with to identify interests that allow us to then engage and have those conversations with China, where it's more than just Canada. It's an entire group of countries, of allies, where those very interests, perhaps those are the interests, and you actually have those conversations. You have that engagement. It's not conversation, you have an engagement that could try to get you into a more meaningful relationship.
So when Mark Carney talks about variable of geometry, what appears in my mind is a Venn diagram with multiple concentric circles that overlap with each other, right? One could represent arbitrary detention, the other one could represent monopoly of critical mineral supply. And we could have multiple circles to cope with the issue of China, such as electoral interference, trade coercion, so on and so forth, which we haven't done. And I think the thing about preemptive guardrail that we should put in place as we proceed with our relationship with China, be it engagement or deeper relationship. These are the concentric circles that I think we should be thinking about preemptively. before problems actually emerge.
Vina.
Yeah. So I think this is the one place where Mary and I have a slightly different view. Can it be done? Yes. Are we currently ready to do that? I'm not sure, because as Lynette is saying, we have been so reactive to what China does, right? Rather than proactively have a really clear understanding of what it is that we want from China and what it is that we are not going to do. And I think we have to also recognize that China is not just any other actor. So Constantine constantly says, well, everybody does that. Well, China is, CCP is Communist Chinese Party. It's much, much more powerful than any other country. It's now a peer state to the US. So it's not just another middle power that we have to kind of manage relations with. We have to recognize their economy is 40 times the size of ours. There have been at this game of essentially creating asymmetric dependencies for 15, 20 years. They're ahead of us on so many things when it comes to industrial strategy. So we have to be realistic of who we are dealing with, and the fact that we haven't done our homework. We have been complacent. And so yes, can we have selective engagement with China? Yes. Do we have the tools right now? No. Can we develop them if we actually put our minds to it? Yes. But we have to have the kind of conversations that you're initiating in this room to be able to do that, because in a democracy, it's not just our political leaders, but people who also need to participate.
That's why we're here.
I think we're already doing some of that.
Yes,
with
precisely
G7 working group.
So precisely the Asia Pacific Foundation and the work that you're doing, and in the region in particular, as part of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, is intended to do that kind of work, to build those coalitions, to actually do the preparatory work. So I think we're actually saying the same thing. I absolutely think we can do it, but those concentric circles have to be drawn. We have to, bring Canadians along and educate Canadians. We've got to be able to bring allies along and educate and collaborate.
I'm jumping in because this
they're the
line's getting
people.
long.
And
Yeah, because they want in. Okay, if you wouldn't mind, give us your first name, perhaps where you're from, and fire away with your question.
Oh, yeah. My name is Zhijian. I'm an international student at the University of Toronto. And I love to talk about rule of law and democracy in Canada. And my sense is there's something wrong with the racial hierarchy with the Chinese, because when we look at the track record of Chinese in Canada, you have the BC construction workers, you have the yellow peril, you have the Chinese head tax, Asian minority, and the hatred during the COVID. So if Canada is being quite a dictatorship to the Chinese Canadians in this country, like who is Canadian government to call Chinese government a dictatorship to them? Because the freedom for Chinese is pretty much the dictatorship to them is pretty much the same in these two countries.
Do you know, okay, that's your view. That's your view.
Well,
I will say,
we don't have Chinese lawmakers in the parliament.
I understand.
Lawyers, journalists, that sort of.
Hello.
I should also say, apparently, when our political leaders go over to China, and Bob Ray and I talked about this just the other day, our former ambassador to the United Nations, as soon as he brings up human rights, the Chinese say, your record on indigenous issues is pretty terrible too, and therefore you're in no position to lecture us. So, where does that get us?
And therefore, we should talk about maximizing interest in self-values. But it's good to see one of our U of T students here. Yeah.
But there is no opportunities for actual Chinese liberals to seek opportunities in Canada.
But let me just say this. I am a Chinese Canadian. I am one of 1.8 million. I'm a proud Chinese Canadian. I'm the first and only full Chinese minister of the Crown, representing Markham Thornhill riding, but sitting around a cabinet table, and the longest serving trade minister. During COVID, we stood up, the Prime Minister stood up to call out the anti-Asian racism. And you're right, for me, it was not lost on me that on July the 1st, a couple of years ago, opening up the Chinese Canadian Museum in Vancouver to acknowledge an exclusion act where someone like me, a sitting member of parliament, was complicit in creating a law that prohibited people like me from coming to the country. But it's about recognizing and acknowledging those, the faults of our past, as we have with Indigenous reconciliation. And the answer is absolutely. There's a lot that we're not proud of. But what have we done about
Well,
it?
that's what Bob Ray says. Bob Ray says,
and what will we continue to do?
Look what we're doing.
Look what we are.
Look what we're doing and look what you're not doing.
And we don't silence those who point that out.
Right, okay, next person.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I'm in finance sector. I'm very happy the issue about China was brought up here, and that's very informative. As a Chinese Canadian, China is very dear to me, but in the meantime, I came to Canada for freedom. When Mark Carney reopened the dialogue with China, I'm very concerned about if Canadian values will be compromised because China leverages the investment and trade to influence Canadian business and public opinion, orchestra transnational repression, and a state-sponsored cyber attack. I'd like to hear the answer from this gentleman about how we can Canada balance the relation between doing trade with China in the meantime, not compromise Canadian values. Thank you.
Fire away.
Thanks. I fail to see how Canadian values could be compromised by doing more business with others, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's the United States. So I don't think Canadian values are that weak to be compromised because we sell more or we sell less. I think this is a characteristic of our country, and mercifully, we're fine with it, and we continue to settle grievances, and we continue to fix problems. We could be doing a better job, of course. You're raising issues that are issues of law. So if there is coercion, if there is illegal activity in this country, we have the laws and the means to put an end to it. We need to try harder. There's no question about it. There's spies.
Let me give Vina a chance to speak to this question too. Do you think if we do more business with these countries, it threatens our values?
Well, it can make us vulnerable to coercion and to compliance with lines of argument that are not consistent with our values. So I think it opens us to that risk, but we have to manage that. So in other words, when Constantine says he can't imagine that world, I mean, we have examples of what that looks like, right? So, because if basically China says, in order to have access to this market, you have to stop criticizing situations of human rights, or you have to stop talking about foreign interference, all of those things. If we were to comply, that would be compromising our values. Now, it makes us more vulnerable if we give them leverage, but it doesn't have to end up there. So there's a way for us to manage both.
And there's different ways to criticize. I mean, you don't have to do it from the rooftops. You can do it behind closed doors. You can take the Chrétien approach, or you can take the Trudeau approach.
Chrétien was dealing with a very different China. So I don't think we can compare what was happening in the 90s and early 2000s with what's happening now. To my point, that China is much more powerful now and demands a lot more compliance from smaller countries like Canada.
But at the same time, there were issues in China that Chrétien, at least as far as he talks about it, criticized behind closed doors.
China was more open to that kind of conversation then than it is now.
Let's get back to the audience here. Julia, you're up.
Yes, hi, I'm Julia Pinella. I live in Cabbagetown. Kind of continuing on the theme of nostalgia as well as labor practices. I want to talk about how Canada has long portrayed itself as a peacekeeping nation. But I want to know, do you think that this facade has faded? We know in many of our supply chains, we have fast fashion like Shein, religious minorities like the Uyghurs who are under forced labor practices, and we're buying tomatoes from them. The EU has taken some action around this by taxing and investigating these practices. And more recently, China is not the only country. Canada also sold armored vehicles to ICE. So I want to know, how can we as Canadians claim ethical leadership while trading with countries tied to human rights abuses?
Anybody in particular you want on this?
Anybody, go for it.
Lynette, go ahead.
To start with, I don't think any country should stand on moral high ground and say that we only do fair trade, because these things are very, very murky. The lines are very murky, right? The examples that you have given, like you really have to break down the ingredients of a shirt, of a blouse, to say that where these ingredients are actually sourced from. It is very, very difficult. But on the questions of vulnerability, as you have mentioned and we discussed earlier, I think Canada, by definition, because of the size of the Chinese diaspora, which I'm one of them, I'm also a Chinese Canadian, is vulnerable to Chinese political interference, whether or not we trade with China. I mean, these are two separate questions. Why are we inflating them? Why are we conflating them, right? And if we do not trade with China, there's another question that we have not asked. How about our economic prosperity? Are we trading off certain things for not trading with China, right? I think we tend to conflate values with interests, and then economic interests and political interests. Maybe we should think about separating them.
Constantine.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that point more. That was an excellent point of conflating things that don't really come together. And bad stuff could happen regardless of whether we're trading with anybody or not. But when it comes to trading with countries that share our values, I'll plagiarize and I'll quote John Ibbotson in the Globe, who said, if we only traded with countries that saw the world the way we see it, we'd be left with maybe Holland and maybe Denmark, and that's it. We wouldn't trade with anybody.
And how boring that would be.
It wouldn't be terribly profitable. But so I think I think we need to compartmentalize trading and protecting the country and the national interest and the rule of law. So trading, as the Prime Minister said, the old way of doing things is dead. I mean, we need to do things differently. And in order to do things differently, we need to take many different approaches and start trading with a...
Again, nobody's saying that we shouldn't trade with China. Again, it depends on what kind of trade. And it's not just about trade, it's also about investment. It's about deeper economic relations. Trade right now is not just about trade. There are links to national security and economic security. And Lynette is right that our vulnerability vis-a-vis foreign interference and diaspora is, of course, baked in, given the composition of Canadian society. But we also have other potential vulnerabilities if we become strategically dependent on China in certain sectors. So you can still become more vulnerable. Just because a certain level of vulnerability is baked in doesn't mean that, oh, well, then in that case, it doesn't matter what else we do. So I think, again, multiple things can be true at the same time. Yes, we have to do some trade with China. China is an important, consequential economic power we cannot ignore. And we have to be clear-eyed about the kind of strategic dependencies, the kind of risks that come with greater engagement, given that trade now is intrinsically linked to national security and economic security. We're not living in a world where politics, trade, diplomacy are separate lanes.
Let's go back to the audience. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Nicholas, former University of Waterloo student. My question is to the entire panel, which is, given that the Chinese and American relationship will likely be the defining relationship of the 21st century, what particular policies or countries can we look at that that could serve us as a template on navigating this relationship? For example, Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew.
Mary, you want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the world is experiencing right now and the great power competition is something that we have not experienced or seen. I don't know necessarily that there is any country that has figured this out. I think we're all in this boat together, and I think I go back to what is it that we need to do as Canada, as a country? What is in our interests? What kind of economy do we want down the road? What stands in the way of our economy getting there? Who should we be partnering with? How do we deepen those relationships in such a way that actually is inherently good for Canadian resiliency, for our economy in the future, for jobs for our workers, for us to be able to innovate, for us to compete, and with whom? I mean, so I think that those are the questions that we as Canadians should be very clear-eyed and very, very focused on, and getting ourselves on a path of accomplishing that over the next number of years and decades, so that Canada continues to have the standard of living that we want, that continues to attract the people that we do, that has the freedoms and the democracy and living within the democratic system that we have enjoyed, and that we will continue to enjoy. I think that's up to us to figure out, and I don't think anyone else has actually got a secret sauce.
Thanks for the question, Nicholas. Let's get the next person in line, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Elliot Chen. I'm a reporter with The Wire China. I think I've spoken to some of you before. It's nice to see you again. My question is about the trade balance. As you know, China spent the last decade spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to achieve self-sufficiency, particularly in high-tech sectors, everything from semiconductors to EVs to even food. there's a world in which China would like to be self-sufficient in all these things and not be dependent on importing from the rest of the world. And so I guess my question is for the members of the panel that are more supportive of a pivot, perhaps Mr. Karayannopoulos, how do you build a sustainable trading relationship when one country wants to sell, everything from Temu goods to chips to EVs, and the other country is primarily offering canola and fish?
It's not going to be easy, but we talked a little bit earlier about, we mentioned rather, an industrial strategy. I think one of the many reasons why North America and Europe developed the way they did in the post-Second World War period is the existence of industrial strategies. In Canada, at least, in the last few decades around the automotive industry, well, perhaps not so much in Canada, but in Ontario and Quebec, I think we need to rethink of what we need to do as a country and where we need to be in 5, 10, 20 years. And I'm not only saying that because that's what China does, but I've had a bit of a front row seat. 2011, the 12 5-year plan, China identified 8 strategic emerging industries, most around decarbonization and the energy transition, that they were absolutely dead set on dominating, using them to drive their industrial expansion. And at the same time, perhaps with the 13th 5-year plan, they determined that needed to be self-sufficient in critical minerals, and they set out to own critical mineral assets around the world. We need to think about what we need to do. When we're talking earlier about digging critical minerals out of the ground, I think we need to be thinking of adding value here in order to feed the EV industry that we've been so generously funding, because if we don't, the lithium is going to come from either China or Chile or Argentina. The magnets will come from China or Europe, the plant that perhaps I built in Estonia. But we need to keep looking at what we can do here. We have fantastic universities. I'm a chemical engineer from U of T, so I'm biased. We have fantastic educational institutions, but we're not using them to the degree that we should be using them.
Let me jump in for a second here.
We've come full circle and we actually agree, which is great.
There we go. Stand by 1 second. Let me just do a time check here. Hillary, how many more questions we got time for?
I think we're at time.
We got 2 questions more. That's all we got time, because they're going to kick us out of the hall soon. So you with the glasses and the person behind you, and forgive me, that's all the time we got. So go ahead, sir.
Only guys with glasses.
Yes, this question's for the panel. My name's Nick. I'm from Corktown. Thinking about the 40+ million citizens of this country that are, from Nunavut to Eastern Canada to Western Canada, the panel did highlight the need for high-value jobs. So what specific sectors should Canada prioritize to ensure variable geometry trade, which you guys mentioned, actually delivers those jobs rather than hollowing those jobs out?
Okay, which sectors should we focus on? Who wants that? Lynette, you want to go for that?
I think we should focus on those sectors where our comparative advantage lies. I'm thinking about agricultural processing, high end of agricultural processing and services sector. I would be wary about building factories, doing industrial policy in large scales. In those sectors, we clearly do not have comparative advantages, because at the end of the day, it is going to be very costly for the economy with hidden costs that taxpayers will have to suffer, and they don't get political voices to be heard.
Vina, quick hit.
I think one thing that we can do is we can connect some of the excellence that we have in AI and robotics and quantum in aerospace with our industry. So really connect that research with industry where I think we can actually move forward, and we can use the billions of dollars that are now being promised for defense spending for those kinds of dual use technologies around cyber, around quantum, around AI, which I think could really position us well, both for our economic needs as well as our defense needs, and meet the various targets that we've put in place to be a good ally.
Okay.
I would also add clean energy.
Clean energy, absolutely.
Particularly around nuclear, where we are an absolute powerhouse, and we've got great technology.
SMRs.
And you add AI into that, and we actually it's really a great strength.
Small
of Canada.
modular reactors.
Yes,
And,
That's what we're
and
doing.
the big ones too. I can't do. I mean,
We've been
the
waiting
medical
all
isotopes.
night long to get to your question.
Thank you.
are the last one. Go for it.
Zach from University of Waterloo, and my question is to the minister, do we think a pivot to China would be cost-free? Because the US could easily retaliate, and given the comparison, even Mexico is retaliating on China and putting tariffs on them to please the US. So do we think it's worth the juice to try to pivot given the huge gaps?
I don't think it's a pivot. I think it is what we all said, what the variety of us said, that we shouldn't ignore the second largest economy in the world, and that there are interests for Canada to expand and to do more in. So I think about tourism, I think about agri-foods, I think about, right? I mean, energy, right? I mean, like, so there are, this is where we do that. And I think we also then think about who else we do more trade with, I mean, around the world, who are our partners, or who should be better, or, who should be deeper partners. So I don't think it's a straight pivot. I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
The idea that the White House needs any rational reason to retaliate is a little bit stretched.
That's a fair point. Should we do the vote one more time just for the heck of it and see if anybody's changed their mind here? How many people are, in light of what's gone on with the United States, we should do a pivot to China, let's dive in deeper. Hands up, please. And hands down. Absolutely not. We don't share their same values, yada, yada, yada. Hands up. Oh, I think the first group got bigger, and I think the second group got smaller.
It's about the same.
About the same.
You think?
I think it's the same.
I think that's my impression here anyway. Anyway, okay, that is our time, and we're going to do a few thank yous here before we leave this evening. First of all, I really want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. People... outside this hall, people may, or if you're watching on television, may not know, it's miserable in Toronto tonight. Now, I know people in North Bay and Sudbury and Thunder Bay are thinking you're a bunch of whiners, it's always cold where we are, but it's miserable out there tonight, and you folks filled the hall, so thank you for coming out. We're very grateful. To our crew, as always, Mark Ford, Chad Castle, Sheldon Osmond, we're grateful for the work you did to make this look as good as it did tonight. To the folks who are with the St. Lawrence Hall, Alex Naylor and his team, great working with you to make all of this happen. Hillary Clark, who produces TVO Today Live, you are the bomb, kiddo, well done. And as always, to the Wilson Foundation and its benefactor, Red Wilson, for enabling this to happen. Everybody's here tonight free of charge. Nobody paid anything to come in tonight because Red Wilson subsidizes this whole thing. So thanks a lot, Red Wilson, for your support of this. For more from this series, you can go to tvo.org/TVO Today Live, or our YouTube channel. Everybody's got a YouTube channel. youtube.com/@TVO Today. And finally, I know, not yet, almost, I know this audience wants to join me in thanking these four for a sublime discussion here tonight at St. Lawrence Hall, so that's great. Terrific. I'm Steve Paikin. Good night, everybody from St. Lawrence Hall. We'll see you again next time.
TVO Today Live is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation.